Once again, thank you for coming to our session on AI and robotics, and welcome to this session, which in particular will focus on the regulatory and policy recommendations in relation to AI and robotics. I am Rowena Rodrigues, Senior Research Manager at Trilateral Research and Deputy Coordinator of the SIENNA project. Trilateral Research is a UK and Ireland-based enterprise with over 80 staff members, and we offer various services in applied research, policy and regulatory advice, privacy and data protection, and data-driven risk identification and assessment. So today's presentation will focus on some of our legal work in SIENNA. What we will also talk about are some of the recommendations that we have come up with for the international level, some EU level recommendations, some national level recommendations, and these are all with a view to promoting ethical and human rights respectful AI and robotics. We are also going to talk through some change ambitions that have come out of our research and that we want to see. And we will also talk through some tensions, and I will present some final thoughts. And what we would also like you to do is to be a more interactive part of this presentation. And therefore, Nicole is now going to share in the chat a link to a Slido poll. And what we're going to do is we'll look through the poll results at the end of this presentation and talk through the discussion and questions, if that's okay. So as we can see, AI and robotics policy and regulation is a very, very active space, and it's highly debated, and it has been for quite some years, at least the recent years, in the international, EU and national levels. Not equally, though, at all levels, and for a variety of reasons. What we can see is there is a cacophony of voices on regulation as depicted here. On the one hand, there is definite concern and recognition that we want to address the issues raised by AI and robotics. There are calls for very bold responses and even outright bans of certain technology applications. Yet there are some who think that AI per se cannot be regulated. Others caution against it rushing in too fast or stifling innovation with hasty measures. There is also a lot of discussion on what measures might be best. Would these be hard measures? Would these be soft? Would combinations potentially work better? Or maybe it's better to have no regulation at all. The objectives and underlying SIENNA motivation behind our work in the legal analysis and the presentation of the recommendations is to ensure that we support and ensure ethical and human rights respectful design, development, deployment, and use of AI and robotics technologies. So let's look at some of the key work that we did and as presented in our reports. So our first key report was Deliverable 4.2, which describes legal issues and human rights challenges of AI and robotics, and also analyzes relevant international, EU, and regional laws and human rights standards. Anais talked earlier in her session about what those legal issues were. This report also summarizes and compares the results of some country studies that we did on law, AI, and robotics. We looked at 12 countries, 8 European and 4 non-European, and these helped to kind of identify a wide range of developments, norms, and underlying values. The report also presents some ways to overcome gaps. And then this legal analysis work was the basis for our recommendations, along with some other research for the enhancement of existing legal frameworks for AI and robotics, alongside the other two areas that we study, which were genomics and human enhancement. And we've also published a couple of policy briefs on our recommendations, which we have shared with policymakers at the EU level and the national level. All our outputs are available on our website and via OpenAir. So let's talk a little bit about the SIENNA legal analysis. And the objectives of the SIENNA legal analysis, of course, were predefined in the SIENNA grant agreement and further refined during the project. So first, what we did was, using desktop research, we identified legal issues related to AI and robotics. We came up with a list of 9 each. Some of the issues are, of course, common problems related to ICT technology in general, though facilitated or in some cases worsened by AI and robotics in some way or another. Other issues, such as legal personhood for AI systems and robots, are novel issues. Many of the identified issues have a wide-ranging impact on human rights and society, and they affect a spectrum of human rights principles such as human autonomy, equality, data protection, human safety. Then we also carried out a study of international EU level and national level laws and human rights standards and developments, again, as I mentioned, of the 12 countries. And you can find the details here in our report. And what we did do was in the national level studies, very specifically also looked at 4 issues, 2 for AI and 2 for robotics. So the 2 issues that we studied in detail for AI were algorithmic bias and discrimination, and the second one was intellectual property issues related to works created by AI. For robotics, the 2 issues that we chose to focus on and study were: has the law created or does it recognize a specific legal status for robots? And the second one was: who is liable for damage caused by robots? And the reason we chose to focus on these 4 issues was, of course, that resources were limited in our project, but at the same time, we wanted to look at issues that were prominent in legal and policy discussions, also had high potential to affect ethical values and human rights, and also added in the criteria of novelty and need for further research. So just to share some of the key findings. So at the international level, what we saw was that the issues are covered in a general sense by international law provisions. Particularly, we looked at the human rights standards and provisions with a few natural exceptions. Of course, the law itself is not AI or robotics specific, but there are other issues like legal personhood or consumer protection issues that are not addressed in international existing human rights treaties. For the EU level, what we see is that the ability of the EU legal framework to meet the challenges of AI and robotics, it's highly differentiated depending on the field. Overall, we can say that the EU can be described as being quite proactive in the field of AI and robotics, given the developments that have occurred over the last 5 years. But effectiveness of the laws, I think, depends on use. And what we can also see is that there has been some discrepancy noticed in the approaches and recommendations of the various EU institutions. For the national level, what we saw was that the legal academic discourses on AI and robotics are established in some countries, while in some other countries, they're in their infancy. So in many of the studied countries at the time of the research, which was in 2018 to 2019, issues pertaining to AI and robotics had attracted the high-level attention of political parties. But at that time, there were no major or significant amendments in legislation bearing upon constitutional or human rights in direct response to AI and robotics. We did look at the developments for the country research for the last 5 to 10 years. In the future, possibly this might change, but we noticed that many countries have adopted a cautious response and have left existing laws to be creatively applied or required existing regulatory bodies to step in. And at the time of the research, no new regulatory bodies had been created to specifically regulate AI or robotics, though calls and proposals had been made. I will now present some SIENNA recommendations for AI and robotics from our legal recommendations report. And while the report has a number of recommendations, we have selected 9 for our presentation, which would benefit from restatement, putting into the spotlight, and particularly given technological developments, deployment, and plans for regulation. So we'll cover these at the international level, EU level, and the national level. So first, our recommendations for the international level. As I said, we have many recommendations, so feel free to look at deliverable 5.6, which is available on Zenodo, and I'll just pinpoint a few of these here today for each of the 3. So one of our recommendations is to incorporate and adopt new interpretative language related to AI and robotics into revised general comments and recommendations for core human rights treaties and other relevant international legal instruments. And this recommendation we make so that we can help clarify and articulate human rights frameworks and standards to address the challenges and impacts of AI. And this recommendation we have targeted at the treaty bodies such as the CERD, the SCR, the CAT, that is the Committee Against Torture, the Committee for the Rights of the Child, the Committee on Migrant Workers, and also at the Council of Europe. Now, to succeed in implementing this recommendation, we must be able to get consensus on the language. Another recommendation that we put forward at the international level is to encourage UN member states to explicitly expand the mandate of national human rights institutions to address impacts of AI and robotics on human rights. And this is very important because we identified in our research various challenges and impacts of AI and robotics. We have seen this, but we think that the national human rights institutions are underutilized bodies in this research. And this recommendation is directed at the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And what we need for this recommendation to succeed, of course, is we need additional resources to be allocated to the national human rights institutions, and we need cooperation of states. The final recommendation that we would like to share with you today from the set of recommendations at the international level is our call to prohibit AI-based racial profiling. And I think this is a significant one that we need to talk about. And it's particularly important given the issues of discrimination that have been widely discussed and raised and are evident, and particularly important in terms of applications like predictive policing algorithms and other security applications. And studies have continuously and continue to show that the lack of transparency and bias training data that is used in such tools are not fit for purpose. And we kind of also recognize the UN CERT, which has noted that the increased use by law enforcement of big data, AI, for example, risks deepening racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and consequently violating many human rights. Of course, for this recommendation to succeed, what we need is more global consensus, and this is probably more likely if it's limited to a specific issue, and the process needs to go a bit faster. So let's look at some recommendations that we proposed at the EU level. So one of the key ones was to create an EU regulatory framework for AI and robotics products and services. And of course, we are very happy to note that we will have an EU regulatory framework for AI. And this is very important because what we need is consistency. We need a harmonized approach across the European Union, and we need to establish common governance standards to address AI and robotics risks. It's not an option not to do anything anymore. And this recommendation was targeted at the EU institutions, particularly Commission, European Parliament, and European Council. What we would say is for this recommendation to succeed, it needs to be aligned with EU societal values and existing legislation. It also at the same time needs to be flexible to technical progress and not become redundant during its development. Another recommendation we put forward at the EU level was to encourage the use of ethical impact assessment, ethics by design, and human rights impact assessments to us as a project, and also given the work that we do, for example, in our other EU-funded project, Sherpa. I think this is a very important one from our point of view because these are various measures that can be incentivized by the law to kind of help address issues in AI and robotics. And this recommendation, again, is targeted at the European Commission and the other EU institutions. And this would help us to increase the reliability and security of AI and robotics products and services, and also make them respectful of European values and rules. And what we need for this recommendation to succeed is we need buy-in to the different methodologies, and particularly with regard to the ethics by design methodology, we need to advance this methodology. We need to test it in different settings. And for the human rights impacts assessment, these have been there for a while. We need more commitment to using HRIAs particularly, and particularly at the high level. Another of our recommendations at the European level was to update the European Pillar of Social Rights to reflect AI and robotics concerns. We think this one hasn't been discussed enough in terms of AI and robotics, but on also other new and emerging technologies. And this recommendation is important because it would help to enhance the protection of vulnerable populations, especially the poor, minorities, and children from the adverse impacts of AI and robotics. How this could possibly happen is that perhaps the EPSR could include a new principle on the protection of the vulnerable populations and perhaps redress from technological harms, or its general content could just be updated to reflect some of the concerns that we have identified in relation to AI and robotics. For this to succeed, what we need is buy-in for the amendments and any new principles from social partners such as civil society organizations. The principles must also be enforceable and supported by implementing measures. So now let's look at some of our recommendations for the national level. And one of the key ones was to implement special protective measures to protect children, racial and religious minorities, political opposition, and activists. This is targeted at national parliament, and this would help improve the protection of fundamental rights and societal values. But to succeed, this recommendation has to address conflicts of interest with majority government priorities when these go against the implementation of such protective measures. Another recommendation we put forward at the national level was to prohibit the use of automated facial recognition technology in public places and to review its use. And this is very important to protect, again, fundamental rights and societal values. This recommendation is targeted at Parliament, and again, here to succeed, it needs some form of industry acceptance, and it presupposes that there is no to limited pre-existing rollout of technologies. And what we see is we have seen developments in terms of a pushback against the use of such technologies in public places, and questions are also being raised about its use and its governance within the public sector. And another recommendation at the national level, which is also significantly important, is to make explicit commitments to reduce technological surveillance of individuals. Why? We need to reduce disproportionate surveillance of individuals perpetuated by such technologies. And to succeed, this recommendation must reduce conflict of interest with the drive to fund and adopt technologies that facilitate large-scale monitoring. Because I think here this is very important to restate, because as one commentator put it very adeptly, AI can make surveillance systems smarter, deeper, and faster, and severely compromise human rights and ethical values, in addition to having a corrosive effect on society. So let's look at the common change ambitions that we found between the three levels. So firstly, at all three levels, what we saw was that there is a need to create new and promote existing avenues or mechanisms for actionable enforcement of existing laws and effective redress of human rights impacts. Between the international and the EU levels, what we kind of discovered is that we need to clarify and expand the scope of key concepts to cover new technological challenges and address discrimination gaps. Between the EU and the national level, what we saw was that, first of all, one of the common change ambitions that was expressed and that has come up consistently is the need to increase the reliability and security of AI and robotics products and services. Secondly, was to make them respectful of EU values. This is applicable to the EU member states, fundamental rights and freedoms. And finally, to reduce mass and disproportionate surveillance of individuals designed into and perpetuated by AI and robotics. But at the same time, while we have all these proposals, we have to recognize that there are a number of tensions that exist. And first and foremost, one of the tensions is a tension between individual and collective rights. For example, taking something to do with our current context, the tension between the collective right to health and the right to privacy, where this has come into the foreground with digital health tracking, screening, and profiling, for example. The second key tension is power conflicts. What is the power of the public sector? What is the power of the private sector? And for example, executive decision-making and funding technologies without parliamentary oversight. Then again, another point of tension is, who does regulation benefit? Is it for the benefit of the developers or deployers, or for the benefit of the adversely impacted or all society? Some regulations do give power to larger corporations who have better compliance resources. Bigger corporations also have huge lobbying resources that do play a part in watering down regulations during public consultation and development, and we need to recognize this. Furthermore, another point of tension is the repurposing of AI and robotics technologies. So sometimes technologies are used for purposes which was not its intended use. And this fits sometimes very uncomfortably within what is technically lawful and might conflict with EU values or cross ethical boundaries. And I think this is something we have to recognize when we are thinking about regulating AI and robotics. There is also the complexity associated with regulating and overseeing surveillance. And finally, there is also one of the key things that we've been discussing for some time, which is the problem with using ethics to hide issues or prevent the implementation of legal regulation. Ethical AI for sure has become a super buzzword. And, we've often heard this mantra of let's be ethical to avoid regulatory burdens. Yes, ethics does play a significantly important role in identifying issues and challenges, and it supports the law in a way that even the law can't. There are some things that even the law can't do. But on the other hand, say, for example, with regard to issues arising from AI-driven mass surveillance, predictive policing, and other harms, they just cannot be addressed by ethical reflection and mitigation alone, but we do need, in addition, a stringent legal obligations to be adopted to protect society and particularly vulnerable communities. So we need to do a lot of unpacking still. The good thing is that the discussion has moved quite forward. Developments are ongoing at the international UN level, at the EU level, and it's being discussed in many fora. But again, we cannot repeat enough that this is something quite important. And just some final thoughts to leave with you. So human rights and ethical frameworks and mechanisms should further underpin and inspire the governance of AI and robotics and other new and emerging technologies. We need to we need to think beyond AI and robotics and think about what comes in the future as well. We need to carefully consider when to regulate. When would it be too early? When would it be too late? Perhaps a multi-layered approach to the time point of regulatory intervention is required. Maybe we need ongoing and incremental regulation and a framework that permeates all the different stages of the development of AI and robotics, from conceptualization right up to use and implementation. Legal changes and specific recommendations by themselves might not be enough, sufficient, or appropriate. So we need to consider what applies in which conditions and under what factor, and taking into account what factors. And finally, we need to pay due consideration to how the law can require and incentivize the right technical standardization and ethical measures. So calling for ethical impacts assessments, or human rights impact assessments, mandating certification, setting procurement criteria, or even setting market entry requirements.